Heavenly Father, I pray for everyone watching this video right now. May you bless them with peace, joy, and breakthroughs in their lives. Amen. Hello, my wonderful family. I am so glad and grateful to have you here with me today. Your support means the world, and I truly don't take it for granted. Before we dive into today's powerful story, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, drop a comment below to share your thoughts, and of course, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update from this channel. Your Honor, I need 5 minutes with my client before we proceed. The words echoed through Courtroom 7B as every head turned toward the defense table, where Victoria Blackwood sat with her hands folded over her rounded belly, her wedding ring catching the fluorescent light. She wasn't looking at her lawyer, Marcus Reed, who had just made the unusual request. She was staring directly at her husband of 8 years across the aisle. David Blackwood felt his chest tighten as he met his wife's gaze for the first time in 3 months. Beside him, Scarlett Morrison squeezed his arm possessively, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. The same suit Victoria had picked out for their anniversary dinner last year, before everything fell apart. "Motion denied, Mr. Reed," Judge Harrison replied curtly. "Mrs. Blackwood, you've had plenty of time to prepare. We're here for the custody hearing regarding your unborn child, and frankly, this court has better things to do than accommodate marital drama." Victoria's lawyer leaned closer to whisper something urgent in her ear, but she shook her head slowly, never breaking eye contact with David. That look, he'd seen it only twice before. Once when she'd discovered her father's cancer diagnosis, and once when she'd found out about the miscarriage they'd never discussed with anyone. "Actually, Your Honor," Victoria said, rising carefully from her chair, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "There's something about this case that Mr. Blackwood doesn't know. Something that changes everything." David's stomach dropped. Scarlett's grip tightened. The courtroom fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the scratch of the court reporter's fingers across her machine. "Mrs. Blackwood," Judge Harrison warned, "this is highly irregular. If you have new evidence—" "It's not evidence, Your Honor. It's the truth about whose child I'm carrying." The words hit David like a physical blow. He felt Scarlett's nails break skin through his jacket as gasps echoed through the gallery. His own lawyer, Patricia Wells, was frantically scribbling notes, but David couldn't focus on anything except the way Victoria's chin lifted slightly. The same defiant gesture she'd made when she'd agreed to marry him despite her parents' objections. "Victoria," he breathed, loud enough for her to hear across the narrow aisles separating their tables. She turned toward him fully now, and he saw something in her expression that made his blood freeze. Not anger, not hurt, not even the devastation he'd expected after walking into court with the woman he'd left her for. Pity. "David," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed courtroom. "Do you remember what you said to me the night before you moved out? When you told me I'd never be able to give you what you really wanted." His mouth went dry. That night rushed back. The fight that had started over dinner plans and escalated into 8 years of buried resentments. He'd said things. Terrible things about her 2 miscarriages, about how maybe Scarlett could give him the family Victoria couldn't. "You said I was broken," Victoria continued, her hand moving protectively over her belly. "You said I'd never carry a child to term. You said maybe it was time to stop pretending I was enough." Scarlett shifted uncomfortably beside him. This wasn't the narrative she'd heard, that Victoria was cold, career-obsessed, uninterested in children. David had painted his wife as the villain in their marriage's collapse, never mentioning the years of fertility struggles, the treatments, the hope followed by devastating loss. "But here's what you never knew, David," Victoria said, and now her voice carried something else. Something that made every person in that courtroom lean forward. "This baby isn't yours." The silence that followed was deafening. David felt the world tilt sideways. Scarlett's hand fell away from his arm like she'd been burned. Even Judge Harrison removed her reading glasses, staring at Victoria with unconcealed shock. "What?" David's voice cracked like a teenager's. Victoria's lawyer was tugging at her sleeve, obviously trying to get her to sit down, but she remained standing. 6 months pregnant, and somehow more commanding than David had ever seen her. "This baby," she repeated, her voice growing stronger, "is not yours. Which means this entire custody hearing is based on a lie. Your lie, David. The lie you told your lawyer, the lie you told yourself, and the lie you told her." She gestured toward Scarlett without looking away from David's face. "That's impossible," Scarlett whispered, but her voice carried in the silence. David said you two were trying. He said the timing matched up perfectly with. With what? Victoria asked, finally turning her attention to the woman who'd been sleeping in her bed for the past 3 months. With when you thought we were still intimate. When exactly did David tell you we conceived this child? David's mind raced backward through lies upon lies. He'd told Scarlett that he and Victoria had been trying to reconcile, that they'd slept together one last time before he'd finally chosen to leave. He'd used that fabricated encounter to explain Victoria's pregnancy, to justify his demand for custody, to paint himself as the wronged party who was simply fighting for his rights as a father. But if Victoria was telling the truth, if this baby wasn't his, then everything crumbled. Who? He managed to ask, though part of him already suspected he didn't want to know the answer. Victoria smiled then, and it was the most devastating expression David had ever seen. Not cruel, not triumphant, just infinitely sad. Someone who was there when I needed him, she said simply. Someone who held me while I cried over you. Someone who saw me as more than broken. The courtroom erupted. Scarlett was on her feet, demanding explanations. Patricia Wells was objecting to something, though David couldn't focus enough to understand what. Judge Harrison was banging her gavel, calling for order. But David heard none of it. All he could process was the realization crashing over him like a tsunami. He'd lost everything for nothing. He'd destroyed his marriage, humiliated his wife, dragged them both through a public legal battle, all while fighting for a child that wasn't even his. And Victoria, pregnant, glowing, stronger than he'd ever seen her, was watching him realize exactly what kind of man he'd become. Welcome, dear listeners, to a story about the price of betrayal and the courage it takes to finally tell the truth. I'm here with you for the next hour and a half as we uncover how one moment of honesty in a courtroom changed 3 lives forever. Because sometimes the most devastating secrets aren't the ones we keep, they're the ones we tell ourselves. 3 months earlier, the pregnancy test sat on the marble bathroom counter like an accusation. 2 pink lines, clear as daylight, mocking Victoria Blackwood as she gripped the edge of the sink until her knuckles went white. This can't be happening, she whispered to her reflection. Not now. Not when David had already moved out. Not when the divorce papers were sitting and signed on the kitchen island downstairs. She'd taken 4 tests. All positive. All impossible. The irony wasn't lost on her. After 3 years of fertility treatments, hormone injections that left her moody and bloated, invasive procedures that turned their bedroom into a clinical schedule, and 2 heartbreaking miscarriages that had driven wedges between them, she was finally pregnant. 6 weeks after her husband had packed his bags and moved in with his 28-year-old marketing assistant. Victoria sank onto the edge of her bathtub, the same one where she'd cried after each negative test, each lost pregnancy, each month that passed without the family they'd once dreamed of building together. David had stopped comforting her somewhere around the 2nd miscarriage. He'd started working later, traveling more, finding excuses to avoid the house that had become a monument to their failures. She should have seen Scarlett Morrison coming. Should have noticed the way David's face lit up when he talked about the brilliant campaign ideas from his new hire. Should have questioned why he suddenly needed to attend so many evening strategy sessions. But Victoria had been drowning in her own grief, convinced that her body's betrayals had driven away the only man she'd ever loved. The doorbell chimed downstairs, pulling her from the spiral of self-recrimination. She glanced at her phone, 7:30 p.m. She wasn't expecting anyone. Victoria, a familiar voice called through the front door. It's Daniel. I brought Chinese food and extremely questionable movie choices. Daniel Chun, her best friend since law school, the man who'd introduced her to David at a charity gala 8 years ago. The one person who'd continued showing up even when she'd pushed everyone else away during the worst of the fertility struggles. She stuffed the pregnancy tests into the bathroom drawer and made her way downstairs, grateful for the distraction. Daniel stood on her doorstep holding bags from her favorite restaurant, his usually immaculate appearance slightly rumpled from his 12-hour surgery schedule at Northwestern Memorial. You look terrible, he said with the brutal honesty that had made him her closest friend. Thanks. Really what every woman wants to hear. She stepped aside to let him in, inhaling the familiar scents of ginger and garlic that made her stomach growl. She hadn't eaten since, when? Yesterday? When's the last time you had a real meal? Daniel dumped the food on the kitchen island, pushing aside the divorce papers without comment. He'd been the one to recommend her lawyer, the one who'd held her while she cried the night David left, the one who'd quietly handled the logistics of separating 8 years of shared life. "I eat," Victoria protested weakly. "Coffee and whatever's left in your work vending machine doesn't count." He was already unpacking containers, moving around her kitchen with the ease of someone who'd been coming here for years. "Sit. Eat. Then we're watching something ridiculously cheesy until you remember how to smile." This was why she'd survived the past 3 months. Daniel's steady presence, his refusal to let her disappear into her own misery, his ability to show up exactly when she needed him most without making her feel like a burden. They ate in comfortable silence, Daniel occasionally making dry observations about his patients that pulled reluctant laughs from her throat. It wasn't until she was halfway through her lo mein that she realized she was actually hungry for the first time in weeks. "Better?" he asked, watching her clean her plate. "Much." She leaned back in her chair, studying his face. The exhaustion around his eyes, the slight stubble that meant he'd come straight from the hospital, the way he'd immediately noticed her state and done something about it. "Daniel, can I ask you something?" "Shoot. Why do you do this? Show up here, take care of me, listen to me complain about my imploding marriage? You're a successful surgeon. You could be out with anyone." "Victoria." His voice was quiet, serious in a way that made her stomach flutter. "You really don't know?" She stared at him, something shifting in the air between them. 8 years of friendship, of shared dinners and late-night conversations, of Daniel being her safe harbor through every storm. How had she never noticed the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching? "Daniel, I've been in love with you since the day I introduced you to David," he said simply. "I watched you fall for him at that gala, watched you build a life together, and I was happy for you because you were happy. But these past 3 months, seeing what he's put you through, how he's made you believe you're somehow not enough." His hands clenched into fists on the counter. "Victoria, you're everything. You always have been." The words hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing with 1,000 implications, 1,000 reasons why this was complicated and dangerous and... "I'm pregnant." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, and Daniel's face went perfectly still. "What?" "I found out 20 minutes before you got here. I took 4 tests. It's real." She pressed her hands against her still flat stomach. "And David doesn't know. Can't know. Because he'll think." She took a shaky breath. "We haven't been together since before he left. This baby isn't his," Daniel finished quietly. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Victoria had been so careful, so methodical about avoiding anything that might complicate the divorce. Except for one night 6 weeks ago, when she'd been particularly devastated by David's latest cruelty, when Daniel had held her while she cried and holding had become kissing, and kissing had become the most tender, desperate hour of her life. They'd both pretended it was grief, that it didn't mean anything, that it wouldn't happen again. But looking at Daniel now, Victoria realized they'd been lying to themselves. "What do you want to do?" he asked carefully. "I don't know." The honesty felt like stepping off a cliff. "I spent 3 years wanting this so desperately, and now that it's happening." She gestured helplessly around the empty house. "Everything's falling apart." Daniel moved around the counter slowly, giving her time to object, time to step away. When she didn't, he cupped her face gently in his hands. "Hey," he said softly. "Nothing's falling apart. Things are changing. There's a difference. Daniel, this is crazy. I'm in the middle of a divorce. I'm about to be unemployed because I can't focus on anything. And now I'm pregnant with my best friend's baby while my husband is. While your soon-to-be ex-husband is playing house with someone barely out of college," Daniel interrupted. "Victoria, you didn't create this mess. David did when he decided you weren't worth fighting for." The tears came then, months of suppressed grief and confusion and fear pouring out of her. Daniel pulled her against his chest, and she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: safety. Not the conditional safety of a marriage that depended on her being perfect, but the unconditional acceptance of someone who'd seen her at her worst and chosen to stay anyway. "I'm scared," she whispered against his shirt. "Of what?" "That I'm going to mess this up. That I'm going to lose this baby like I lost the others. That David's going to find out and try to take custody just to hurt me. That you're going to realize this is too complicated and..." "Victoria." His voice was firm enough to cut through her spiral. "Look at me." She pulled back to meet his eyes, dark and serious and full of something that made her chest tight. "I've waited 8 years for you," he said. "I'm not going anywhere because things got complicated. And David..." His jaw tightened. David made his choice. Now it's time for you to make yours. Outside, rain began pattering against the windows of the house that had once felt like a prison, but was starting to feel like sanctuary. Victoria thought about the divorce papers on the counter, about the pregnancy that should have been impossible, about the man who'd loved her silently for nearly a decade while she'd been married to someone else. And for the first time in months, she thought about the future with something that felt dangerously close to hope. What she didn't know was that 3 blocks away, David Blackwood was having his own crisis of conscience, staring at his phone and debating whether to call his wife. And what neither of them knew was that Scarlett Morrison was already planning the betrayal that would bring them all to that courtroom 3 months later. 2 months before the courtroom. The ultrasound photo was face down on David Blackwood's mahogany desk when he returned from his lunch meeting, tucked halfway under his keyboard like someone had slipped it there quickly. His secretary, Mrs. Patterson, had already left for the day, and the executive floor of Blackwood Industries was empty except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 23 floors below. David picked up the black and white image with trembling fingers. There, clear as day, was the fuzzy outline of a baby. His baby, written in Victoria's careful handwriting across the bottom. 12 weeks, due March 15th. His legs gave out, and he collapsed into his leather chair, staring at the evidence of everything he'd thought he'd lost. A child. The family he'd always wanted. The future he'd convinced himself Victoria could never give him. Son of a bitch, he breathed, pressing his palms against his eyes until he saw stars. 12 weeks meant conception had happened in late June. Right around the time he'd moved out. Right around the time he'd been telling Scarlett that his marriage was completely over, that he and Victoria hadn't been intimate in months. Right around the time he'd been lying to everyone, including himself, about why his marriage had really fallen apart. His phone buzzed with a text from Scarlett. Asterisk dinner at 8? I made reservations at that place you love. Asterisk. The same restaurant where he'd proposed to Victoria 6 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him, but these days, everything reminded him of his wife. Ex-wife. Soon-to-be ex-wife. The woman who was apparently carrying his child and hadn't told him. David's finger hovered over Scarlett's contact. He should call her, explain about the pregnancy, figure out what this meant for their relationship. But instead, he found himself scrolling to Victoria's number, thumb poised over the call button. What would he even say? That he was sorry? That he'd made a mistake? That seeing proof of their child made him realize he'd thrown away 8 years for a pretty face and the ego boost of being wanted by someone young enough to be his daughter? The truth was more complicated than that, and David knew it. He'd left Victoria not because she couldn't have children, but because he'd been terrified she never would. Terrified of facing another miscarriage, another round of treatments, another cycle of hope and devastating loss. It had been easier to blame her, to paint her as cold and career-focused, than to admit he'd been the coward who'd run when things got difficult. Before he could talk himself out of it, he dialed Victoria's number. David. Her voice was careful, guarded. Is everything okay? I got your message, he said, then immediately felt stupid. She hadn't sent him a message. Someone else had put that ultrasound on his desk. What message? The ultrasound photo. Victoria, why didn't you tell me you were pregnant? The silence stretched so long he thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable than he'd heard in years. How did you? She stopped, took a breath. David, we need to talk. But not over the phone. I can come over. Tonight. We can. No. The sharpness in her voice cut him off. Not the house. Somewhere neutral. Grant Park by the fountain. 1 hour. She hung up before he could respond, leaving David staring at the ultrasound photo and wondering who'd wanted him to know about his wife's pregnancy badly enough to slip into his private office. Meanwhile, across town, Scarlett Morrison sat in her BMW in the parking garage beneath David's building, watching his Mercedes disappear into the evening traffic through the security cameras she'd hacked using skills from her computer science degree. The degree David had no idea she possessed. She'd been many things before becoming David Blackwood's marketing assistant. A programmer at a tech startup, a graduate student in cybersecurity, a woman who'd spent 2 years planning her approach to one of Chicago's most successful venture capitalists. David thought their meeting had been chance, a lucky interview that had landed her the perfect job. He had no idea she'd been tracking his company's growth, his personal life, his marriage's deteriorating state for months before applying. She'd researched Victoria Blackwood too, of course. The successful estate planning attorney, the woman who'd built her own practice from nothing, the wife who'd suffered through years of fertility struggles while maintaining a perfect public facade. Scarlett had counted on those struggles, had planned to position herself as the fertile young woman who could give David everything his wife couldn't. What she hadn't counted on was Victoria getting pregnant. Scarlett's phone buzzed with David's text. Asterisk something came up. Need to reschedule dinner. I'll explain later. Asterisk. She stared at the message, her carefully constructed plans crumbling around her. 6 months of manipulation, of playing the understanding mistress, of positioning herself as David's future while his marriage imploded. 6 months of listening to him complain about Victoria's coldness, her career obsession, her inability to give him a family. And now Victoria was pregnant. Scarlett had taken the ultrasound photo from Victoria's car that morning. A lucky break when she'd spotted Victoria's BMW at the medical center where Scarlett had been following her, documenting her routine for weeks. The photo had been sitting on the passenger seat like a gift from the universe. But instead of devastating Victoria by revealing her pregnancy to David, Scarlett was realizing she'd handed David exactly what he'd been looking for: a reason to go back to his wife. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Hello. Is this Scarlett Morrison? The voice was crisp, professional, female. Who's asking? My name is Patricia Wells. I'm an attorney representing David Blackwood in his divorce proceedings. I understand you've been involved with my client during the separation period. Scarlett's stomach dropped. She'd been so careful to keep their relationship quiet, to avoid exactly this kind of complication. I'm not sure what you're implying. Ms. Morrison, I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. You've been living in Mr. Blackwood's downtown condo for the past 2 months. You've accompanied him to business events. You've been photographed together at multiple restaurants. Patricia's voice was coolly professional. What you may not know is that Mrs. Blackwood's attorney has been documenting this relationship very thoroughly. What do you want? Scarlett's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. I want to help you understand the situation you've found yourself in. Mrs. Blackwood is pregnant. Mr. Blackwood is the father. And if this divorce proceeds as planned, you're going to find yourself not just unemployed, but potentially liable for alienation of affection damages that could bankrupt you for the rest of your life. Scarlett's hands shook as she gripped the phone. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. David was supposed to choose her, build a new life with her, give her the financial security and social status she'd worked so hard to achieve. However, Patricia continued, there might be another way to look at this situation, a way that could benefit everyone involved. I'm listening. Mrs. Blackwood's pregnancy changes the dynamics significantly. Child custody, support obligations, the division of assets, all of it becomes more complicated and more expensive for my client. Unless, of course, certain facts about the timeline and paternity came into question. Scarlett felt something cold settle in her stomach. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Ms. Morrison. I'm simply observing that you have intimate knowledge of Mr. Blackwood's whereabouts and activities during the relevant time period. Knowledge that could be very valuable to the right party. The line went dead, leaving Scarlett staring at her phone in the dim parking garage, realizing she'd just been recruited as a weapon in a war she'd never wanted to fight. Grant Park, 1 hour later. Victoria pulled her coat tighter against the October chill as she approached the fountain where she and David had had their first official date 8 years ago. He was already there, pacing back and forth with the restless energy she'd once found attractive, but now recognized as the anxiety of a man who'd lost control of his carefully managed life. Victoria. He turned as she approached, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen in years: genuine emotion. Not anger, not frustration, but something raw and uncertain. You look pregnant, she supplied dryly, though at 16 weeks she was barely showing. Beautiful, he finished quietly. You look beautiful. The compliment hit her like a physical blow, not because it was false, but because it was too late. 3 months too late, to be precise. David, before you say anything else, you need to know that this doesn't change anything between us. Doesn't change, Victoria, you're carrying our child. Our baby. After everything we went through, all the treatments, the losses. Our baby. Victoria's voice was sharp enough to cut through his building excitement. David, you left me. You moved out, moved in with your girlfriend, and started divorce proceedings. You don't get to waltz back in and claim this child just because it's convenient for you now. That's not. He ran his hands through his hair, the gesture so familiar it made her chest ache. Victoria, I made mistakes. I was angry and hurt, and I blamed you for things that weren't your fault. But this baby changes everything. We could try again, go to counseling, work through. No. The word came out with a finality that surprised them both. David, I'm not going back. Not to that house, not to that marriage, and definitely not to being the consolation prize you settle for when your midlife crisis doesn't work out. She's not a midlife crisis, David said, but the words lacked conviction. Scarlett and I have something real. She understands me in ways that you. Stop. Victoria held up her hand. Just stop. I don't care about your relationship with your assistant. What I care about is protecting this baby from the mess you've made of our lives. Protecting the baby from me? David's voice rose. Victoria, I'm the father. I have rights. Legal rights that your lawyer can't just wish away. There it was. The threat she'd been expecting, wrapped in the language of parental concern, but sharp with the promise of legal warfare. This was the David she'd learned to fear over the past year. The man who wielded his wealth and connections like weapons when he didn't get his way. Actually, she said carefully, that's something we need to discuss. Something in her tone made David go very still. What do you mean? Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a folded document, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. I mean that if you want to claim parental rights, you're going to have to prove paternity. And given the timeline, given when you moved out and when this baby was conceived, that might be more complicated than you think. David stared at the paper like it might burst into flames. Victoria, what are you saying? I'm saying that DNA doesn't lie, David. And neither do calendars. She handed him the document, a formal request for paternity testing. If you want to be this baby's father, you're going to have to prove it in court. The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down, and Victoria watched David's face cycle through confusion, denial, and dawning horror as he realized what she was implying. You're telling me this baby might not be mine? I'm telling you that I'm not going to let you destroy this child's life the way you destroyed our marriage. Victoria's voice was steady, but inside, her heart was breaking. Not for David, but for the future she was about to set in motion. If you want a custody battle, David, you'll get one. But it's going to cost you everything. She turned to walk away, leaving him standing by the fountain with the paternity testing papers in his hand, and the first real fear he'd felt in years spreading through his chest like ice. What neither of them saw was Scarlett Morrison in her BMW across the street, photographing the entire exchange with a telephoto lens, already planning how to use what she'd witnessed to save herself from the legal and financial ruin Patricia Wells had so eloquently described. The point of no return had been crossed. The war for the future of Victoria's child was about to begin. And everybody was about to learn that in family court, there are no winners, only survivors. 6 weeks before the courtroom, the law offices of Hartley, Wells and Associates buzzed with the kind of predatory energy that only came from high-stakes divorce cases involving 8-figure net worths. Patricia Wells sat behind her mahogany desk, reviewing surveillance photos with the methodical precision of a surgeon planning a complex operation. Scarlett Morrison perched on the edge of the client chair, her designer handbag clutched in white-knuckled hands. 6 weeks of playing double agent had taken its toll. The confident young woman who'd walked into David Blackwood's life had been replaced by someone who jumped at shadows and checked her phone obsessively. These are excellent, Patricia said, spreading the photographs across her desk like playing cards. Victoria and Dr. Chin at dinner, entering his building together, him leaving her house the next morning. She looked up at Scarlett with approval. You've been very thorough. I feel sick, Scarlett whispered, staring at an image of Victoria laughing at something Daniel had said, her hand resting on her growing belly. David still thinks this baby might be his. He's planning to fight for custody, and I'm helping you prove it's not even his child. Ms. Morrison, Patricia's voice carried the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. You seem to be under the impression that you have a choice in this matter. Let me clarify your situation. She pulled out a thick folder and opened it with theatrical precision. 3 months ago, you used false credentials to gain employment at Blackwood Industries. Yes, we know about the fabricated references from companies that don't exist. 2 months ago, you illegally accessed David's private computer files to obtain financial information about his marriage. And 6 weeks ago, you committed breaking and entering when you took that ultrasound photo from Victoria's car. Scarlett's face went white. You can't prove any of that. I can prove all of it. Patricia's smile was razor-sharp. The question is whether I need to. You can continue helping us build this case, or you can find yourself facing federal charges for identity theft and corporate espionage. Your choice. Before Scarlett could respond, Patricia's secretary buzzed through the intercom. Ms. Wells, Mr. Blackwood is here for his appointment. Send him in. Patricia quickly gathered the photos, but not before Scarlett caught a glimpse of one that made her stomach lurch. Victoria and Daniel kissing outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Victoria's lab coat suggesting she'd met him at work. David strode into the office with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight that mattered. But Scarlett could see the cracks in his armor. The shadows under his eyes, the way his expensive suit hung slightly loose, the constant checking of his phone for messages from Victoria that never came. Patricia, I hope you have good news, he said, settling into the chair beside Scarlett without really looking at her. This paternity test demand is ridiculous. Victoria's playing games, trying to get leverage in the divorce settlement. Actually, David, we need to discuss some developments. Patricia's tone was carefully neutral. It seems Victoria's claims about the timeline may have more merit than we initially thought. David went very still. What are you talking about? When exactly did you and Victoria last have intimate relations? Patricia asked bluntly. I don't see how that's. David. Patricia's voice cut through his evasion like a scalpel. Your wife is claiming this child isn't yours. If we're going to fight that claim, I need facts, not emotions. David's jaw worked silently for a long moment. Beside him, Scarlett felt her heart sink as she watched the man she'd upended her life for struggle with a truth he'd been avoiding. We weren't. Things had been difficult for a while, he admitted finally. The fertility treatments, the miscarriages, all the pressure, it affected our physical relationship. We probably hadn't been together in that way for 3 months? Maybe 4? Before I moved out. And when did you move out? Patricia was taking notes now, her pen scratching across legal paper with mechanical precision. June 15th. David's voice was barely audible. And according to the medical records Victoria's lawyer provided, conception occurred around June 20th. Patricia set down her pen and looked at David with something approaching pity. David, I need you to understand what we're dealing with here. If Victoria can prove this child isn't yours, not only do you lose any claim to custody, but the entire framework of our divorce strategy collapses. That's impossible, David said, but the words lacked conviction. Victoria wouldn't. She's not the type to have an affair. Scarlett nearly choked on the irony. David, the man who'd left his wife for his employee, couldn't conceive of Victoria being unfaithful. But she'd seen the photos, witnessed the tender way Daniel looked at Victoria, observed their easy intimacy from her surveillance posts. I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise, Patricia continued. We have documented proof that Victoria has been involved with Dr. Daniel Chen for at least the past 2 months. A relationship that appears to be quite serious. David's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine. Denial, anger, something that looked almost like relief, then devastation as the implications sank in. You're telling me Victoria's been having an affair, he said slowly. I'm telling you that Victoria has moved on, Patricia corrected. The question is whether this relationship predates your separation or began afterward. And more importantly, whether Dr. Chen is the father of her child. Scarlett watched David absorb this information. Seeing the exact moment he realized that everything he'd believed about his marriage, his wife, and his future was crumbling. The worst part was the flash of something in his eyes that looked suspiciously like hope. As if Victoria having an affair would somehow absolve him of his own betrayals. What do we do? He asked finally. We proceed carefully, Patricia said. If we can establish that Victoria's relationship with Dr. Chen began before your separation, we can claim alienation of affection. If we can prove he's the father of her child, we eliminate your support obligations and potentially gain grounds for a more favorable asset division. But if I'm not the father, David's voice trailed off as the reality hit him. There's no baby, no family, no reason to try to reconcile. The silence in the office was deafening. Scarlett realized she was holding her breath, waiting to see which version of David would emerge from this revelation. The man who genuinely wanted a family, or the man who wanted to win at any cost. There's something else, Patricia said, pulling out another folder. Dr. Chen has a significant trust fund from his deceased parents. Northwestern Memorial pays him extremely well. If he's the father of Victoria's child, she won't need spousal support from you. In fact, She'll likely waive all claims to your assets. David's head snapped up. What are you saying? I'm saying that if we play this correctly, if we can prove paternity and Victoria's infidelity, you could walk away from this divorce with everything intact. Your business, your assets, your freedom to start fresh with Scarlett. For a moment, Scarlett felt a surge of hope. Maybe this could work out after all. Maybe David would choose the future with her over the past with Victoria. Then she saw his face. David wasn't looking at her with love or gratitude or even acknowledgement. He was looking at Patricia with the focused intensity of a predator who'd just spotted wounded prey. How do we prove it? He asked. We escalate, Patricia said simply. We force Victoria into a corner where she has to choose between protecting her relationship with Dr. Chun and protecting her financial future. We make this so public, so messy, that she'll agree to anything just to make it stop. What about Scarlett? David asked, and for a moment, Scarlett's heart lifted. What about her? Patricia's smile was coldly professional. Ms. Morrison has been very helpful in gathering information. I'm sure she'll continue to be cooperative. The dismissal in Patricia's tone was unmistakable, but it was David's lack of response that cut Scarlett to the bone. He didn't defend her, didn't object to being discussed like she wasn't in the room, didn't even look at her. This was the moment Scarlett understood that she'd never been anything more than a weapon in David's war against his marriage. A pretty young thing to boost his ego and make Victoria jealous. Now that he was facing the reality of losing his wife to someone else, Scarlett had become expendable. I need some air, she managed, standing on unsteady legs. Of course, Patricia said without looking up from her notes. David and I have strategy to discuss anyway. Scarlett stumbled out of the office, past the secretary who didn't bother to look up, past the expensive art and fresh flowers that decorated the reception area. She made it to the elevator before the tears started, before the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. She destroyed her career, her reputation, and possibly her freedom to chase a man who'd never really seen her as anything more than a convenient distraction. And now that same man was planning to destroy the woman he'd claimed to love, all to avoid facing the consequences of his own choices. The elevator doors opened on the parking garage, and Scarlett stepped out into the fluorescent-lit concrete cave that seemed to match her current emotional state. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, we need to talk. Coffee tomorrow, 10 a.m., Corner Bakery on Michigan. Come alone. V asterisk. Victoria. Somehow, Victoria knew about the surveillance, about Scarlett's role in building the case against her. And instead of having her arrested or exposing her to David, she wanted to meet. Scarlett stared at the message, realizing she was about to discover just how far Victoria Blackwood was willing to go to protect her unborn child. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria sat in Daniel's kitchen, her laptop open to the private investigator's report she'd commissioned 3 weeks earlier. Every photograph, every documented meeting between Scarlett and Patricia Wells, every piece of evidence that proved her husband's mistress was actively working to destroy her. You don't have to do this, Daniel said, reading over her shoulder. We could just let the paternity test speak for itself. Prove the baby's mine and walk away clean. And let David destroy the next woman who gets in his way? Victoria shook her head. No. Scarlett made her choices, but she's being manipulated by people who see her as disposable. She deserves to know what she's really involved in. Daniel's arms came around her from behind, his hands settling protectively over her growing belly. At 20 weeks, their baby was becoming real, moving and responding to Daniel's voice when he talked to her stomach at night. You're going to be an amazing mother, he murmured against her ear. I hope so. Victoria leaned back against his chest, allowing herself a moment of peace before tomorrow's confrontation. Daniel, are you sure about this? About us? Once this all comes out, there's no going back. David's going to make our lives hell. Let him try. Daniel's voice carried a steel she'd rarely heard. Victoria, I've loved you for 8 years. I've watched David take you for granted, hurt you, abandon you when you needed him most. If he wants a war, he can have one. But he's going to lose. Victoria turned in his arms, studying the face that had become more familiar to her than her own. The man who'd held her through 2 miscarriages, David, had been too uncomfortable to discuss. The man who'd celebrated every small victory in her law practice, while David complained about her working too much. The man who'd loved their baby from the moment she'd told him, without hesitation or condition. I love you, she said, the words still feeling new and dangerous and perfect. I love you too. He kissed her softly, then pulled back with a grin. Now stop worrying and let's focus on tomorrow. Ms. Morrison is about to learn the difference between playing games with a marketing budget and playing games with a family lawyer who graduated summa cum laude from Harvard. Victoria laughed despite herself, feeling the baby kick as if responding to her laughter. Tomorrow, she would begin the final phase of her plan to protect her child and expose the truth about David's manipulations. What she didn't know was that Patricia Wells had anticipated this move and was already preparing a counterstrike that would force Victoria to make an impossible choice between her child's future and Daniel's freedom. The pressure was building on all sides, and someone was about to break. Daniel's apartment 1 hour later. Daniel Chin opened his front door with the smile that had become as natural as breathing over the past 6 months. The expression of a man seeing the woman he loved. But the smile died the moment he saw Victoria's face. "Victoria? What's wrong? Is it the baby?" She pushed past him into the living room, the manila envelope clutched in her white-knuckled grip like evidence at a crime scene. Daniel followed, his surgeon's instincts cataloging her symptoms. Elevated stress, shallow breathing, the particular stillness that preceded either flight or fight. "Sit down," Victoria said, her voice carrying a professional distance that made Daniel's stomach clench. "Victoria, you're scaring me. What happened?" "Sit down." He sank onto the couch where they'd spent countless evenings planning their future, where he'd held her while she felt the baby's first kicks, where they'd talked about names and nursery colors and the life they were going to build together. The irony wasn't lost on him that this was also where he'd been sitting 20 minutes ago, staring at Marcus Blackwood's contract and trying to find the courage to tell her the truth. Victoria remained standing, her lawyer's posture rigid with controlled fury. She opened the envelope and let the contents spill across his coffee table like accusations made manifest. "Explain this," she said simply. Daniel stared at the photographs, the payment records, the handwritten notes in his own script. His mind raced through possible explanations, ways to minimize the damage, strategies for salvaging something from the wreckage about to unfold. Then he looked at Victoria's face, at the devastation and betrayal written there, and realized that the time for strategies had passed. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "Since an hour ago." Victoria's voice cracked despite her efforts to maintain control. "Daniel, please tell me there's an explanation. Tell me this isn't what it looks like. Tell me that the man I fell in love with, the father of my baby, wasn't paid by my husband's family to seduce me." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 6 months of deception crushing down on him. "It's not that simple." "Then make it simple." The words came out as a whisper. "Please." "Marcus approached me 8 months ago," Daniel began, his voice flat with the precision of a medical report. "He knew about the problems in your marriage, knew David was planning to leave you. He offered me a consultation fee to provide psychological support during your divorce." Psychological support. Victoria repeated the words like they tasted bitter. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Victoria, you have to understand. I'd been in love with you for years. Marcus didn't have to pay me to care about you. He just gave me an excuse to finally act on feelings I'd been suppressing. So you took his money and decided to play therapist with my emotions?" "I took his money because I'm drowning in medical school debt and my residence salary barely covers my rent." Daniel's composure cracked, revealing the desperation underneath. "My parents' trust fund was frozen after their deaths, tied up in probate for 3 years. I needed the money, and Marcus needed someone close to you who could document David's emotional abuse for the divorce proceedings." Victoria stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the man she'd thought she knew. "What was phase 2, Daniel?" "The phase you recommended in your report to Marcus." Daniel's face went white. He'd forgotten about that particular document, written in the early weeks when he'd still believed he could maintain professional distance. "Victoria, what was phase 2? Her voice was deadly quiet. "Emotional dependency," he whispered. "Make you dependent on me for support, so you wouldn't be tempted to reconcile with David." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stood frozen, one hand pressed against her belly as if shielding their baby from the truth they were uncovering. "And you succeeded," she said finally. "I became completely dependent on you. Emotionally, physically, financially. I restructured my entire life around our relationship. I'm having your baby." Her voice broke on the last word. "Daniel, I fell in love with you. Really, truly, completely in love. And you were taking notes about it for Marcus fucking Blackwood." "Victoria, please." Daniel stood, reaching for her, but she stepped back like he'd tried to strike her. "Don't touch me." The command was sharp enough to freeze him mid-gesture. "Don't you dare touch me. Not when I don't know what's real and what was part of your psychological manipulation." "Everything after the first month was real," Daniel said desperately. "Victoria, I fell in love with you too. Completely. The reports to Marcus stopped after we slept together the first time because I couldn't continue documenting something that had become so personal." "Prove it." "What?" "Prove that you love me. Show me something, anything, that demonstrates your feelings weren't just part of the job." Victoria's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks like the most elaborate con job in history. A doctor with psychological training, hired by my husband's brother, who just happened to be in the perfect position to manipulate a lonely, vulnerable woman going through a devastating divorce." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then closed it as the full scope of his situation became clear. Every gesture of love, every tender moment, every declaration of feeling could be reinterpreted through the lens of professional manipulation. How do you prove authentic emotion when the foundation of the relationship was built on deception? "I can't," he admitted finally. "There's nothing I can show you that wouldn't look calculated in hindsight." Victoria nodded like she'd expected that answer. "Daniel, I need you to leave." "Leave?" "Victoria, this is my apartment. I need you to pack a bag and go somewhere else for a few days. I need space to think, to figure out what this means for our baby, for the custody case." She was moving toward the door, her movements sharp and brittle. "I can't be around you right now without questioning every word that comes out of your mouth." "Victoria, wait." Daniel followed her, panic rising in his chest. "What about the baby? What about us? What about the life we planned?" She turned at the door, and the expression on her face was worse than anger. It was pity. "Daniel, there is no us. There never was. There was you, following a script written by Marcus Blackwood, and me, too stupid and desperate to realize I was being played." She placed her hand on the doorknob. "The only real thing in this entire relationship is this baby, and right now, I'm not even sure you deserve to be part of their life." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of the world. David's condo that evening. David Blackwood sat in his living room, staring at the city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows that had once made him feel powerful, but now just made him feel exposed. Scarlett had been gone when he'd returned from the office, her clothes missing from the walk-in closet, her toiletries cleared from the bathroom counter. She'd left a note on the kitchen island. "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry for everything." His phone had been buzzing with calls from Patricia Wells all afternoon, but David hadn't answered. He knew what she wanted, to discuss strategy, to plan the next phase of their assault on Victoria's credibility. But something about seeing Victoria's devastated face at the coffee shop that morning had shifted something inside him. Scarlett had told him about the meeting, about the documents Patricia had shown Victoria, about the revelation that Daniel Chun had been paid by Marcus to manipulate his wife. David had felt a moment of savage satisfaction. Victoria, the woman who'd made him feel like a failure for 3 years, had been played by a man who was literally paid to love her. But the satisfaction had curdled quickly into something that felt suspiciously like guilt. His phone rang again. This time it wasn't Patricia, it was Marcus. "David, we need to talk." "Do we?" David's voice was flat. "I just found out that you hired Victoria's boyfriend to seduce her. Without telling me, while I was in the middle of divorcing her." "I was protecting your interests," Marcus said, his tone carrying the patience of an older brother who'd spent 45 years cleaning up David's messes. "You wanted out of that marriage, and Victoria was going to take you to the cleaners. I found a way to give you leverage. By paying someone to emotionally manipulate my wife while she was vulnerable? By paying someone to document the truth about her psychological state during the divorce proceedings." Marcus's voice hardened. "David, you called me crying after Victoria's second miscarriage, begging me to help you figure out how to leave without looking like the bad guy. I solved your problem." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What are you talking about?" "The night she lost the baby, you called me drunk and sobbing, saying you couldn't handle another cycle of hope and loss, that you were going to leave her, but you needed to find a way to make it look like her fault." Marcus's words were precise, surgical. "You specifically asked me to find dirt on Victoria that would justify your affair with your assistant." The memory hit David like a physical blow. That night, the worst night of his life, when he'd held Victoria while she grieved their lost child and known, with horrible certainty, that he didn't have the strength to go through it again. He'd been drunk, devastated, and desperate when he'd called Marcus. But he didn't remember asking his brother to destroy Victoria. He remembered asking for help, for options, for a way out that wouldn't make him the villain in their story. "I didn't ask you to manipulate her," David said weakly. "You asked me to solve your problem. I solved it." Marcus's voice carried no emotion, no regret. Dr. Chin was supposed to document Victoria's emotional instability and provide evidence of her unfitness as a mother. Instead, he fell in love with her and got her pregnant. So now we're improvising. Patricia Wells has been coordinating with me from the beginning. The custody case, the affair documentation, the psychological manipulation allegations, it's all designed to break Victoria completely. She'll sign whatever settlement we put in front of her just to make it stop. David sank into his chair, feeling the full weight of what he'd set in motion. "Marcus, you have to call this off." "Absolutely not. We're too close to winning." "Winning what?" David's voice cracked. "Marcus, she's pregnant. Victoria's having a baby, and you're trying to destroy her mental health too." "What?" "Save me money in the divorce." "To save your company," Marcus corrected. "Victoria could have claimed half of Blackwood Industries. Now she'll be lucky to get spousal support for 2 years. You'll be free to start over with someone who actually wants to be with you instead of someone who sees you as a consolation prize." The words hit David like a slap. "Victoria never saw me as a consolation prize. Didn't she?" Marcus's laugh was bitter. "David, she turned down my friend's proposal to marry you. Dr. Richard Hayes, the cardiologist. Ring any bells? Victoria was dating him when she met you, and she was in love with him. She chose you because you were safe, stable, the kind of man who'd give her the suburban life she thought she wanted." "That's not true. Ask her. Ask Victoria if she ever loved Dr. Hayes. Ask her if she settled for you because he wasn't ready for marriage and kids." Marcus's voice was relentless. "You've spent 8 years married to a woman who was in love with someone else, and now you're feeling guilty about giving her a taste of her own medicine?" David hung up without responding, his mind reeling. Richard Hayes. He remembered the name from Victoria's past, remembered her mentioning him casually in their early dating days. A brilliant surgeon who'd broken her heart by not being ready to commit. Had Victoria married him on the rebound? Had their entire marriage been built on her settling for second best? His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "If you want to know the truth about your wife's past, meet me at Grant Hospital. Dr. Hayes is working the night shift in cardiology." Patricia Wells. Still pulling strings, still manipulating the situation, still convinced she could orchestrate everyone's lives to her advantage. David stared at the message for a long time, then grabbed his keys. If he was going to destroy Victoria's life, he needed to know if she'd destroyed his first. Victoria's house, midnight. Victoria sat in the nursery she'd started decorating 3 weeks ago, surrounded by paint samples and furniture catalogs and the dreams she'd built with a man who'd been paid to love her. The rocking chair Daniel had assembled was positioned by the window, facing the garden where they'd planned to teach their child to plant flowers. Her phone had been ringing all evening, Daniel, Patricia Wells, even David, but she'd ignored them all. There was nothing anyone could say that would make this situation better, and plenty they could say to make it worse. The baby moved restlessly in her womb, responding to her stress with increased activity. Victoria placed both hands on her belly, trying to project calm she didn't feel. "I'm sorry, little one," she whispered. "I'm sorry your mommy was stupid enough to believe in fairy tales. I'm sorry your daddy was paid to love us. I'm sorry we're all caught up in a game where nobody wins except the lawyers." Her doorbell rang at 12:47 a.m. Victoria considered ignoring it, but something about the pattern, 3 short chimes, a pause, then 3 more, made her stomach clench. Only one person rang her doorbell like that. She made her way downstairs, checking the security panel before opening the door. Daniel stood on her porch, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "I know you don't want to see me," he said before she could speak. "But Victoria, there's something you need to know. Something that changes everything. Unless you have a time machine that can undo the past 6 months, I'm not interested." "Patricia Wells has been recording us," Daniel said simply. "Everything. Our conversations, our intimate moments. She has cameras in my apartment, listening devices in my car. She's been documenting our relationship from the beginning." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. "What?" "I found them tonight when I went back to pack. Professional-grade surveillance equipment, probably installed while I was at work." Daniel's voice was hollow with exhaustion. Victoria, she has hours of footage of us together. Private conversations, personal moments, things that were never meant to be shared with anyone. Why are you telling me this? Because tomorrow, she's going to use that footage to destroy both of us in court. Daniel stepped closer, and Victoria could see the genuine anguish in his eyes. She's going to play recordings of us talking about David, about the custody case, about our relationship. She's going to make it look like we conspired together from the beginning. Victoria sank against the doorframe, the full scope of Patricia's manipulation finally becoming clear. Not only had she orchestrated Victoria's emotional devastation, she documented it for legal purposes. Daniel, Victoria said quietly, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Tomorrow morning, you're going to call Northwestern Memorial and request an immediate transfer to their Seattle branch. You're going to pack whatever you can carry and disappear before this gets any worse. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. You're not leaving me. You were never really here. Victoria's voice was gentle but implacable. The man I fell in love with doesn't exist. You're a doctor who got paid to play a role, and now that role is over. The kindest thing you can do for our baby is to disappear before Patricia uses your presence to take custody away from me. Victoria, please. The word came out as a broken whisper. Please just go. Let me try to salvage something from this disaster before it's too late. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, and Victoria saw the exact instant he realized she was right. His presence in her life, his love for her, real or manufactured, had become a liability she couldn't afford. For what it's worth, he said finally, everything I felt for you was real. The love, the hope, the dreams we made together. That was never part of any plan. I know, Victoria replied, and meant it. But it doesn't matter anymore. She closed the door gently, leaving Daniel standing alone on her porch while she collapsed against the wall, one hand pressed against her belly and the other covering her mouth to muffle the sobs that threatened to tear her apart. In 12 hours, she would walk into that courtroom to fight for her child's future. She would face David, Patricia Wells, and a legal system designed to punish women who dared to want both love and independence. And she would do it completely alone, because everyone she'd trusted had been working for the other side from the very beginning. The morning of the custody hearing, Victoria stood in her walk-in closet at 5:47 a.m., staring at the navy blue suit she'd worn to her law school graduation 8 years ago. It had been her armor then, the outfit of a woman ready to conquer the world. Now it felt like a costume for a role she was no longer sure she knew how to play. Her phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer, Marcus Reed, *emergency. Meet me at the office in 1 hour. Patricia Wells filed new motions this morning. We need to talk, *. Victoria's hands shook as she read the message. Whatever Patricia had planned as her final strike, it was happening today. She pressed her palm against her belly, feeling their baby's reassuring movement, and whispered, Whatever happens today, little one, I promise you this. I will not let them use you as a weapon. Reed and Associates, 6:30 a.m. Marcus Reed's office looked like a war room. Documents covered every surface, multiple laptops displayed legal briefs, and 3 cups of cold coffee suggested he'd been working all night. When Victoria walked in, his expression was grimmer than she'd ever seen. Sit down, he said without preamble. Victoria, what I'm about to show you is going to be difficult to hear, but you need to understand what we're walking into. He handed her a thick manila folder. Patricia Wells filed an emergency motion last night claiming you're mentally unfit to have custody of your child. She's arguing that your relationship with Dr. Chun was evidence of compromised judgment, that you've been emotionally manipulated to the point where you can't protect your baby from further exploitation. Victoria opened the folder and felt her world tilt sideways. The first document was a psychological evaluation she'd never consented to, based on observational data collected over the past 6 months. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, a prominent family psychologist, had concluded that Victoria exhibited classic signs of emotional dependency, impaired decision-making capacity, and vulnerability to manipulation by predatory individuals. I never spoke to this Dr. Hartley, Victoria said, her voice hollow. She based her evaluation on surveillance footage and audio recordings provided by Patricia Wells. Marcus pulled out his laptop and turned it toward Victoria. They have hours of material, Victoria. Conversations with Daniel where you express doubt about your ability to be a mother, moments where you break down emotionally, discussions about your fears and insecurities. The screen showed a frozen image of Victoria crying in Daniel's arms, the timestamp indicating it was from 2 weeks after David had left. She remembered that night. She'd been devastated by David's cruelty, questioning everything about herself and her worth as a woman. They're going to argue that you're so psychologically damaged from your marriage that you can't distinguish between genuine affection and manipulation, Marcus continued. That your pregnancy itself is the result of compromised judgment, and that your child would be safer in David's custody. But David left me, Victoria protested. He abandoned our marriage for another woman. How can he claim to be the stable parent? Because Patricia's spinning it differently. Marcus clicked to another document. She's arguing that David's affair was a response to your emotional unavailability, that he was driven away by your psychological instability, and that he only stayed in the marriage as long as he did out of concern for your mental health. Victoria stared at the legal briefs reframing 8 years of her life as the delusions of an unstable woman. Every moment of pain, every struggle with fertility, every tear she'd shed was being recontextualized as evidence of her unfitness as a mother. There's more, Marcus said quietly. Patricia subpoenaed your medical records from the fertility clinic. The psychological counseling sessions you attended during the treatments, the antidepressants you were prescribed after the miscarriages, the notes about your adjustment difficulties with the hormone treatments. Those are private medical records, Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. She knew that in custody cases, privacy was a luxury the court rarely afforded. She's painting a picture of a woman who's been psychologically unstable for years, who made poor decisions about her marriage, her career, and her relationships because of underlying mental health issues. Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. Victoria, this is a character assassination designed to make you look like you can't be trusted with your own child's welfare. Victoria closed the folder, feeling the weight of Patricia's strategy settling over her like a shroud. It was brilliant in its cruelty. Use Victoria's genuine struggles, her authentic emotions, her real vulnerabilities as evidence that she was unfit to be a mother. What about Daniel? She asked. If they're arguing that I was manipulated, doesn't that make him the villain in this scenario? That's the beautiful part of Patricia's strategy, Marcus said bitterly. She's positioned Daniel as both the predator who manipulated you and the victim of Marcus Blackwood's scheme. He's testifying this morning that he was hired to provide psychological support, that he never intended for the relationship to become romantic, and that he's as much a victim of the Blackwood family's manipulation as you are. Victoria felt her last hope crumble. He's testifying against me? He's testifying to save himself. If he admits to deliberately manipulating you while being paid by David's family, he could face criminal charges for fraud and potentially lose his medical license. Marcus's voice was gentle but implacable. Victoria, Daniel chose his career over your family. I'm sorry. The betrayal was somehow worse than all the others. Not because she'd expected better from Daniel, but because it meant their child would grow up knowing that their father had chosen his own interests over their mother's fight for custody. So what are my options? Victoria asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. We can fight this. Challenge the surveillance evidence as illegally obtained. Question the validity of the psychological evaluation. Argue that David's abandonment of the marriage demonstrates his unfitness as a parent. Marcus paused. But Victoria, I have to be honest with you. Patricia Wells is very good at what she does, and she's had months to build this case. The odds of you retaining full custody are not good. What's the alternative? Marcus pulled out another set of documents. Joint custody. You acknowledge that you made some poor decisions during the divorce proceedings, agree to ongoing psychological counseling, and accept a shared custody arrangement with David. Victoria read through the proposed agreement, each clause feeling like a small death. Shared custody meant her child would spend half their time with David and Scarlett, being raised by people who saw children as trophies to be won rather than humans to be loved. It meant David would have equal say in every major decision about their child's life, despite having walked away from their marriage when things became difficult. And if I refuse, if I fight this in court, then Patricia will present every piece of surveillance footage, every private conversation, every moment of genuine human emotion as evidence that you're psychologically unfit to raise a child. Marcus's expression was pained. Victoria, they have recordings of you crying about feeling like a failure as a woman, questioning whether you'd be a good mother, expressing fears about repeating your parents' mistakes. Taken out of context, presented to a judge who doesn't know you personally. I could lose custody entirely, Victoria finished. It's possible. Patricia's asking for emergency temporary custody pending a full psychological evaluation that could take months. During that time, your child would live with David and Scarlett while you fight to prove your mental fitness to be a parent. Victoria closed her eyes, imagining her newborn baby being raised by the woman who'd helped destroy their family, learning to call Scarlett Mama, while Victoria became a visitor in their own child's life. How long do I have to decide? The hearing starts in 2 hours. Judge Harrison is going to want an answer today. Victoria stood up slowly, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. In 2 hours, she would walk into that courtroom and face the most impossible choice of her life. Accept joint custody with the man who'd abandoned her, or risk losing her child entirely to prove a point about justice. Marcus, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think I'm mentally unfit to be a mother? Marcus studied her face for a long moment. The woman who'd built a successful law practice from nothing, who'd survived years of fertility struggles with grace, who'd endured her husband's betrayal and discovered her lover's deception, and still managed to think clearly about her child's welfare. Victoria, I think you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. But strength doesn't always win in family court. Sometimes survival does. Victoria nodded, understanding the distinction. She could be right, or she could be a mother. In Patricia Wells' carefully constructed reality, she couldn't be both. I need to make a phone call, she said. To whom? To the one person in this entire mess who might actually tell me the truth. Grant Hospital, 7:30 a.m. Dr. Richard Hayes looked exactly the same as he had 10 years ago when Victoria had loved him with the desperate intensity of a 25-year-old law student who thought she'd found her soulmate. Tall, distinguished, with the kind of confidence that came from saving lives on a daily basis. He'd agreed to meet her in the hospital cafeteria before his shift started, probably out of curiosity more than concern. They'd spoken only once since she'd married David, a brief, polite conversation at a medical charity event 5 years ago. Victoria, he said, standing as she approached his table. You look. He paused, taking in her pregnancy, her obvious stress, the shadows under her eyes. You look like you're going through hell. That's an accurate assessment. She sat down carefully, noting how Richard's gaze lingered on her belly with something that might have been regret. Richard, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Okay, did you ever love me? Really love me? Or was I just convenient until you were ready to settle down with someone more suitable? Richard's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, guilt, something that looked like pain. Why are you asking me this now, after all these years? Because my husband's family is trying to prove that I've never been mentally stable enough to make good decisions about relationships. They're claiming that I married David on the rebound from you, that our entire marriage was based on my settling for second best. Victoria's voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. I need to know if that's true. Richard was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he'd been avoiding for a decade. Victoria, what we had was real. More real than anything I'd experienced before or since. He looked up at her, and she saw genuine anguish in his eyes. I loved you completely. I still love you, if I'm being honest. Then why didn't you fight for me? Why did you let me walk away when David proposed? Because I was a coward. The admission came out quietly, but with the weight of years of regret behind it. I was 32 years old, finally hitting my stride professionally, and the idea of marriage and children terrified me. Not because I didn't want them with you, but because I'd seen what happened to my colleagues who tried to balance demanding careers with family life. Victoria felt something inside her chest crack open. Not heartbreak, but a different kind of pain. The pain of realizing that her entire adult life might have been built on a foundation of mutual cowardice and missed opportunities. I convinced myself that you'd be happier with someone like David, Richard continued. Someone who could give you the stable, traditional life I thought you wanted. Someone who wouldn't ask you to wait while I figured out how to be a husband and a surgeon at the same time. So you let me marry someone else. I let you marry someone else, and I've regretted it every day since. Richard reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Victoria, David never deserved you. He never understood what he had. And if your family is falling apart now, it's not because you made poor choices. It's because he was too small-minded to appreciate the extraordinary woman he married. Victoria stared at their joined hands, remembering what it felt like to be loved by someone who saw her clearly, valued her completely, and chose her anyway. The irony wasn't lost on her, that she was rediscovering this feeling hours before she might lose the right to raise her own child. "Richard, I need to ask you one more thing. Anything. If I lose custody of my baby today, if the court decides I'm mentally unfit to be a mother, would you testify as a character witness? Would you tell them that I'm not the unstable woman they're painting me to be?" Richard's grip on her hand tightened. "Victoria, you're not going to lose custody of your child. You're the most capable, loving person I've ever known. Any court that can't see that is blind." "That's not an answer." "Yes," he said firmly. "I'll testify. I'll tell them that you're the woman who should have been my wife, who should have been the mother of my children, and who deserves to raise her baby without interference from people who wouldn't recognize genuine love if it bit them." Victoria felt tears she'd been holding back for days finally spill over. Not because she was sad, but because someone, had seen her clearly and chosen to fight for her rather than against her. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Richard said, pulling out his phone. "Give me 2 hours. I'm going to make some calls, talk to some colleagues who know you, who've watched your integrity over the years. If Patricia Wells wants to wage war on your character, she's going to discover that you have allies she never counted on." Victoria looked at this man who'd broken her heart 10 years ago and was now offering to help her save her future, and realized that sometimes the most important victories came from the most unexpected allies. In 90 minutes, she would walk into that courtroom and face the fight of her life. But for the first time in months, she wouldn't be walking in alone. The impossible choice was still ahead of her, but maybe, just maybe, she was about to discover that impossible and inevitable weren't the same thing. Courtroom 7B, 10:00 a.m. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through Chicago's legal community that Patricia Wells was orchestrating the trial of the decade. A custody case that would either cement her reputation as the city's most ruthless family lawyer or expose her methods as unconscionably manipulative. Victoria sat at the defendant's table with Marcus Reed, watching David enter with Scarlett Morrison and Patricia Wells. David looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, his usual confidence replaced by something that resembled barely controlled panic. Scarlett walked beside him with the mechanical precision of someone heavily medicated, her eyes unfocused and her movements stilted. But it was Patricia Wells who commanded the room's attention. Impeccably dressed, carrying herself with the predatory grace of someone who'd never lost a case she was determined to win, she moved through the courtroom like she owned it. Judge Harrison took the bench at exactly 10 a.m., her expression already suggesting she was tired of this case before it had officially begun. "This is an emergency custody hearing in the matter of Blackwood versus Blackwood," she announced. "Ms. Wells, I understand you filed several last-minute motions?" "Yes, Your Honor. Given the serious nature of the allegations against Mrs. Blackwood's fitness as a parent, we've compiled substantial evidence that demonstrates." "Objection, Your Honor." Marcus Reed stood, his voice carrying clearly across the packed courtroom. "Ms. Wells is making opening statements without establishing the legal foundation for this hearing." Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Reed, this is your client's emergency custody hearing. I assumed you'd requested it." "Actually, Your Honor, Mrs. Blackwood did not request this hearing. Ms. Wells filed the emergency motion claiming Mrs. Blackwood posed an immediate danger to her unborn child. We're here to respond to accusations that have no basis in fact or law." Victoria felt a surge of gratitude toward Marcus. He was forcing Patricia to justify her position before allowing her to launch into character assassination. "Ms. Wells," Judge Harrison said slowly, "please explain the emergency that necessitated this hearing." Patricia stood, her confidence unwavering. "Your Honor, we have documented evidence that Mrs. Blackwood has been involved in a relationship with Dr. Daniel Chun. A relationship that began as a professional psychological manipulation arranged by a third party. Mrs. Blackwood was unaware she was being manipulated, which demonstrates compromised judgment that poses a risk to her ability to protect her child from future exploitation. And you have evidence of this alleged manipulation?" "Extensive evidence, Your Honor. Audio recordings, video surveillance, financial records, and testimony from Dr. Chun himself." Judge Harrison turned to Marcus. "Mr. Reed, how does your client respond to these allegations?" Marcus stood slowly, and Victoria could see the barely contained fury in his posture. "Your Honor, what Ms. Wells describes as evidence is actually the product of an illegal surveillance operation orchestrated to destroy my client's character and steal custody of her child." We're prepared to demonstrate that this entire case is built on fabricated evidence and criminal conspiracy." The courtroom erupted in whispers. This was far more dramatic than anyone had expected. Not just a custody dispute, but allegations of criminal activity. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Reed," Judge Harrison said. "Do you have evidence to support it?" "We do, Your Honor. But first, I'd like to call Dr. Richard Hayes to testify about Mrs. Blackwood's character and mental fitness." Victoria watched Patricia's face carefully as Richard entered the courtroom. For the first time since she'd known her, Patricia Wells looked surprised. Richard took the stand with the calm authority of someone who'd testified in malpractice cases, but Victoria could see the barely controlled anger in his eyes as he was sworn in. "Dr. Hayes," Marcus began, "how long have you known Mrs. Blackwood?" 10 years. We dated for 2 years in law school, and I've followed her career with great interest since then. In your professional and personal observation, would you describe Mrs. Blackwood as mentally unstable or unfit to be a parent?" Richard's laugh was sharp with disbelief. "Absolutely not. Victoria Blackwood is one of the most psychologically sound, intellectually capable, and emotionally mature people I've ever known. The suggestion that she's unfit to be a parent is not just wrong, it's absurd." "Objection," Patricia called. "Dr. Hayes is not qualified to make psychological assessments." "Sustained," Judge Harrison said. "Dr. Hayes, please limit your testimony to your personal observations." "Your Honor," Richard said, turning toward the bench, "I am actually qualified to speak to Mrs. Blackwood's psychological fitness. I completed a residency in psychiatry before switching to cardiology, and I've been observing her behavior and decision-making for a decade." Victoria felt her heart stop. Richard had never mentioned psychiatric training. She watched Patricia's face go white as this revelation destroyed a key pillar of her strategy. "In your professional opinion," Marcus continued, "does Mrs. Blackwood exhibit signs of compromised judgment or emotional instability?" "No. What she exhibits are signs of being systematically emotionally abused by her husband and then manipulated by people who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity." Richard's voice was steady, professional, devastating. "The fact that she fell for Dr. Chen's manipulation doesn't indicate mental instability. It indicates that she was targeted by sophisticated predators who exploited her isolation and grief." "Objection." Patricia was on her feet, her composure finally cracking. "This witness is speculating about matters outside his knowledge." "Your Honor," Marcus said calmly, "Dr. Hayes is responding to the psychological evaluation Ms. Wells submitted, which was based on surveillance footage rather than actual clinical assessment. If Ms. Wells can submit amateur psychological analysis, surely we can respond with actual professional expertise." Judge Harrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to untangle the competing narratives. "I'll allow the testimony, but Dr. Hayes, please be specific about the basis for your professional opinions." "Your Honor, I've reviewed the surveillance footage Ms. Wells submitted as evidence. What she's characterized as emotional instability and compromised judgment are actually normal psychological responses to systematic emotional abuse and manipulation." Richard pulled out a folder Victoria hadn't seen before. "I've prepared a detailed analysis comparing Mrs. Blackwood's documented behavior to established patterns of abuse recovery and manipulation victim psychology." Victoria stared at Richard in amazement. Somehow, in the 2 hours since their conversation, he'd assembled a professional psychological assessment that directly countered Patricia's strategy. "Dr. Hayes," Marcus continued, "in your opinion, would Mrs. Blackwood be able to protect her child from future manipulation or abuse?" "Absolutely. One of the strongest indicators of psychological health is the ability to recognize manipulation once it's been exposed. Mrs. Blackwood has demonstrated exactly that capacity. She identified the deception in her relationship with Dr. Chun and took immediate steps to protect herself and her child." Patricia was scribbling notes frantically, clearly trying to adapt her strategy to this unexpected development. But Victoria could see panic in her movements, the desperate energy of someone watching a carefully constructed plan collapse. "Dr. Hayes," Marcus said, approaching his crucial question, "do you believe Mrs. Blackwood should have custody of her child?" "I believe any child would be fortunate to have Victoria Blackwood as their mother. She's intelligent, compassionate, resilient, and demonstrates the kind of moral courage that makes excellent parents." Richard looked directly at David as he spoke. "Unlike some people in this courtroom, she's never abandoned someone she claimed to love when they needed her most." Objection. Patricia shot to her feet. Inflammatory and prejudicial. Sustained. Judge Harrison said, but Victoria caught a slight smile on the judge's face. Dr. Hayes, please limit your commentary to the question asked. Your Honor, Marcus said, I have no further questions for this witness. Patricia stood for cross-examination, but Victoria could see the uncertainty in her posture. Richard's testimony had fundamentally altered the narrative she'd been building. Dr. Hayes, Patricia began, isn't it true that you have personal feelings for Mrs. Blackwood that might bias your testimony? Yes, Richard said simply. I love her. I've loved her for 10 years, and I'll probably love her for the rest of my life. That doesn't make my professional assessment any less valid. It makes it more informed. The honesty of the answer clearly threw Patricia off balance. She'd expected denial, defensiveness, something she could attack. And isn't it true that Mrs. Blackwood left you for Mr. Blackwood? No. I let her go because I was too immature to fight for what we had together. That's my failure, not hers. Victoria felt tears she'd been holding back all morning finally spill over. Richard was systematically dismantling every weapon Patricia had tried to use against her. Dr. Hayes, Patricia tried again. You weren't present during Mrs. Blackwood's marriage or her relationship with Dr. Chun. How can you assess her judgment about those relationships? Because I've seen the surveillance footage you submitted as evidence, Richard replied calmly. What you're calling poor judgment looks to me like a woman trying desperately to save her marriage and then, when that failed, trying to rebuild her life with someone she believed cared about her. Neither of those decisions suggests mental instability. They suggest hope, resilience, and the kind of emotional courage most people never demonstrate. Patricia sat down abruptly, clearly recognizing that continuing to question Richard would only reinforce his testimony. Your Honor, Marcus said, I'd like to call our next witness, Mrs. Scarlett Morrison. The courtroom fell silent as Scarlett walked to the witness stand. She moved like someone walking to her own execution, her face pale and her hands shaking as she was sworn in. Ms. Morrison, Marcus began gently, you've been involved with Mr. Blackwood during his separation from Mrs. Blackwood? Yes. Her voice was barely audible. And you've also been working with Ms. Wells to gather evidence against Mrs. Blackwood? Scarlett's eyes darted to Patricia, who was watching her with the focused intensity of a snake preparing to strike. Ah, yes. I've been cooperating with the legal proceedings. Ms. Morrison, were you aware that Ms. Wells had installed surveillance equipment in Dr. Chen's apartment? Aye. Scarlett looked genuinely confused. What surveillance equipment? Victoria felt the first surge of hope she'd experienced all morning. Scarlett clearly didn't know about the illegal surveillance, which meant Patricia had been operating without her knowledge. Ms. Morrison, Marcus continued, did Ms. Wells ever ask you to do anything illegal in gathering information about Mrs. Blackwood? Scarlett was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, she looked up at Victoria with something that resembled regret. She asked me to take things from Victoria's car. Personal documents. She said it was legal because Victoria had left them in plain sight, but... Her voice trailed off. But you had doubts? I knew it was wrong. Scarlett's voice was stronger now, and Victoria could see her making some kind of internal decision. I knew all of it was wrong. The surveillance, the manipulation, the way we were using people's emotions against them. Objection. Patricia was on her feet, her face flushed with anger. Ms. Morrison is not qualified to make legal judgments about investigative techniques. Your Honor, Marcus said calmly, Ms. Morrison is testifying about her own actions and knowledge. She's certainly qualified to speak to that. I'll allow it. Continue, Ms. Morrison. Scarlett took a deep breath, and Victoria could see her making the choice to tell the truth regardless of the consequences. Ms. Wells showed me photographs and documents that proved Dr. Chun was being paid to manipulate Victoria. She said we needed to expose this to protect Victoria from further harm. Scarlett's voice was gaining strength. But then I realized that Patricia had been manipulating me the same way Dr. Chun had been manipulating Victoria. We were all just pieces in her game. The courtroom was completely silent. Victoria could see David staring at Scarlett with something approaching horror as he realized the extent of the deception that had surrounded their relationship. Ms. Morrison, Marcus said, in your opinion, based on what you observed, is Mrs. Blackwood mentally fit to raise her child? Scarlett looked directly at Victoria, and for the first time since this whole nightmare had begun, Victoria saw something like respect in the younger woman's eyes. Victoria Blackwood is the strongest person I've ever met. She survived a marriage to a man who abandoned her when she needed him most. She discovered she was being manipulated by someone she trusted, and she's still fighting for her baby's future. Scarlett's voice was clear now, decisive. If I ever have children, I hope I'm half as good a mother as she's going to be. Victoria felt something break open in her chest. Not pain, but relief so profound it was almost overwhelming. After months of feeling completely alone, someone was finally fighting for her instead of against her. Ms. Morrison, Marcus said, do you have any knowledge of illegal surveillance conducted by Ms. Wells? Before Scarlett could answer, the courtroom doors burst open. Federal agents entered in formation, led by a woman in a dark suit who walked directly to Patricia Wells. Patricia Wells, the lead agent announced, you're under arrest for violation of federal wiretapping laws, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Patricia stood frozen as handcuffs were placed on her wrists, her face cycling through shock, rage, and something that looked like fear. Your Honor, the federal agent said to Judge Harrison, we have evidence that Ms. Wells has been conducting illegal surveillance operations in connection with this case. We'll need to suspend these proceedings pending our investigation. Judge Harrison's gavel banged repeatedly as she tried to restore order. Ladies and gentlemen, this court is in recess pending resolution of these criminal allegations. But Victoria wasn't listening to the chaos around her. She was watching David's face as he finally understood the full scope of what Patricia had done, not just to Victoria, but to him, to Scarlett, to everyone who'd been caught in her web of manipulation. For the first time in 8 years, David Blackwood looked like a man who was genuinely ashamed of himself. As federal agents led Patricia Wells out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Victoria realized that the impossible choice she'd thought she was facing, between justice and motherhood, had been resolved in a way she'd never imagined. Sometimes the most devastating secrets aren't the ones we keep. They're the ones that get exposed at exactly the right moment. And sometimes, just sometimes, the truth really does set everyone free. 3 hours later, Judge Harrison's chambers asterisk. The chaos in the courtroom had settled into something resembling order, but the real resolution was happening in the quiet sanctuary of Judge Harrison's private office. Victoria sat across from the judge's desk, Marcus Reed beside her, while David occupied a chair near the window with his hastily appointed new attorney. Scarlett Morrison had been released pending further questioning, but not before providing a detailed statement about Patricia Wells' illegal surveillance operation. The federal investigation would take months, but the immediate crisis was over. Mrs. Blackwood, Judge Harrison began, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd seen too many families destroyed by legal warfare. This has been one of the most unusual custody cases I've presided over in 23 years on the bench. Victoria nodded, one hand resting protectively on her belly where her baby, now 22 weeks along, moved restlessly, as if sensing the tension in the room. Your Honor, Victoria said quietly, I want to say something before you make any decisions about custody. Please proceed. Victoria stood slowly, her lawyer's training taking over despite the emotional exhaustion of the past months. David didn't abandon this marriage because I was mentally unstable. He left because we both forgot how to fight for what we had together. I spent so many years trying to be the perfect wife that I lost track of who I really was. And David spent so many years expecting perfection that he forgot how to love someone through their struggles. She turned to look at her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, and saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. Genuine remorse. The fertility treatments, the miscarriages, the pressure we put on ourselves to create the perfect family. It broke us both. But David, what broke us wasn't my inability to have children. It was our inability to support each other through the pain of trying. David's face crumpled, and Victoria realized he was crying for the first time since their second miscarriage 3 years ago. Victoria, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I am so sorry. For everything. For leaving you when you needed me most. For bringing Scarlett into our mess. For letting Patricia turn our divorce into a war zone. He looked down at his hands. I never wanted any of this to happen. I know, Victoria replied simply. But David, wanting isn't the same as choosing. You chose to leave. You chose to trust Patricia. You chose to let someone else manipulate our situation instead of talking to me directly. Judge Harrison watched this exchange with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes healing happened in courtrooms, not just legal resolution. Mr. Blackwood, the judge said, Do you still want to pursue custody of Mrs. Blackwood's child? David was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the city where they'd built and destroyed their life together. Your Honor, he said finally, I thought I wanted custody because I thought this baby was mine. Then I thought I wanted custody because I was angry that it wasn't. But sitting here now, watching Victoria fight for her child's future with more courage than I've ever shown for anything. He shook his head. This baby deserves a mother who will never give up on them. Victoria is that mother. Are you withdrawing your custody petition? Yes, Your Honor. I'm withdrawing all claims to custody. I'm also waiving any rights to visitation or involvement in this child's life. David looked directly at Victoria. This baby isn't mine, and I have no right to insert myself into their family. Victoria felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally flow freely. Not tears of sadness, but of relief so profound it felt like being able to breathe again after nearly drowning. Mrs. Blackwood, Judge Harrison said gently, how do you want to proceed with the divorce settlement? I want it finalized as quickly as possible, Victoria replied. I'll waive all claims to spousal support and David's business assets. I just want my freedom and my baby's security. That's very generous, considering the circumstances. Your Honor, I don't want anything from David except the chance to start over. Victoria's voice was steady, confident. I've learned something important over the past few months. I don't need someone else's money or validation to build a good life. I just need the people who actually choose to be in my corner. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly. Very well. I'll sign the divorce decree and custody orders today. Mrs. Blackwood, you'll have full legal and physical custody of your child, with no claims from Mr. Blackwood. As they prepared to leave the judge's chambers, David approached Victoria hesitantly. Victoria, can I say something? She nodded, curious what final words he might have after 8 years of marriage and 6 months of warfare. You're going to be an incredible mother, he said quietly. And someday, when this baby asks about their father, I hope you'll tell them that their mother is the strongest, most courageous person I've ever known. David, Victoria said gently, take care of yourself. Really, figure out who you are when you're not trying to be someone else's idea of perfect. You might surprise yourself. He nodded, understanding that this was both forgiveness and goodbye. Northwestern Memorial Hospital, 2 weeks later. Victoria sat in the hospital cafeteria where she'd had her revelation with Richard 2 weeks earlier, but this time she wasn't alone. Richard sat across from her, and beside him was Dr. Sarah Chun, Daniel's younger sister and, ironically, one of the best family therapists in Chicago. I've been treating Daniel since he returned from Seattle, Sarah said, her voice professional but warm. Victoria, I want you to know that his feelings for you were genuine. The manipulation, the financial arrangement with Marcus Blackwood, that was real. But so was his love for you and for your baby. Victoria nodded, having suspected as much. How is he? Struggling. He's been seeing patients at Seattle Children's Hospital, trying to rebuild his sense of purpose. He's also been in intensive therapy, working through the guilt of what he did to you. Sarah paused. He asked me to give you this. She handed Victoria a sealed envelope with her name written in Daniel's careful script. Victoria opened it slowly, finding a single sheet of paper with a brief message. Victoria, *, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I'm writing to tell you that loving you and our baby was the most real thing that ever happened to me, even though it began as a lie. *. I've established a trust fund for our child's education and medical expenses. You'll never have to worry about providing for them financially. It's not an attempt to buy my way back into your life. It's an acknowledgement that I owe them a father's support even if I can't be their father. *. I hope someday you'll tell them that I loved them from the moment I knew they existed, and that letting them go was the hardest thing I've ever done. *. Be happy, Victoria. You deserve every beautiful thing life has to offer. *. Daniel. Victoria folded the letter carefully, feeling a complex mixture of sadness and closure. Daniel had finally chosen to do the right thing, even when it cost him everything he wanted. Sarah, Victoria said, will you tell him something for me? Of course. Tell him that I forgive him. Not because what he did was okay, but because holding on to anger would poison the love I want to give our baby. And tell him that if he ever wants to be part of this child's life, really be part of it as their father, not as someone trying to manage his guilt, he needs to prove he's someone they can trust. That might take years, but the door isn't permanently closed. Sarah smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd shown during their conversation. "I'll tell him. And Victoria, I think you're going to be an amazing mother." After Sarah left, Victoria and Richard sat in comfortable silence, watching the flow of hospital staff and visitors moving through their routines of healing and hope. "Richard," Victoria said finally, "I need to ask you something important. Anything. I'm not looking for someone to rescue me or help me raise this baby. I'm not looking for a replacement father or a convenient solution to being a single mother." She turned to face him directly. "But if you're interested in building something real with me, something that starts with honesty and grows slowly and includes space for me to be a mother and a lawyer and a whole person, then I'd like to see where that leads." Richard's smile was radiant. "Victoria, I've been waiting 10 years for you to be ready for something real. I can wait as long as you need me to wait now." "Good," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Because this baby and I are a package deal, and we come with the kind of complications that scare away anyone who isn't absolutely certain about what they want." "I want you," Richard said simply. "Both of you. However long it takes, whatever it requires. I want to build a life that's worthy of the family you're creating." Victoria felt her baby kick as if responding to Richard's words, and she laughed, the first truly carefree sound she'd made in months. "Well then," she said, "I guess we're going to find out what happens when people actually choose each other instead of just settling for each other." 6 months later, Victoria's new house. Victoria stood in the nursery of the house she'd bought with the money from selling the home she'd shared with David. It was smaller, cozier, filled with furniture she'd chosen herself rather than inherited from a marriage that had never quite fit. In her arms, baby Eleanor Chun Blackwood slept peacefully, 6 weeks old and perfect in every way Victoria had dreamed. Eleanor, named for Victoria's grandmother, the woman who'd taught her that strength and gentleness weren't opposites but partners. Richard appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of tea and watching Victoria with the expression of a man who still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "How are my girls?" he asked softly. "We're perfect," Victoria replied, and meant it. "Richard, come here. I want to show you something." She led him to the window that overlooked their small garden, where spring flowers were beginning to push through the soil they'd planted together last month. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing to a small green shoot emerging from the earth. "The tulips." "The beginning," Victoria corrected. 6 months ago, I thought my life was ending. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. My marriage, my trust in my own judgment, my faith in love itself. But look what grew from all that devastation. Eleanor stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that meant she was waking up and would soon demand her mother's full attention. "Victoria," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, "thank you." "For what?" "For choosing to trust again. For letting me be part of this family you're building. For showing me what real love actually looks like." Victoria smiled, adjusting Eleanor in her arms as her daughter's eyes opened, bright and curious and ready to take on the world. "Richard, we're not choosing to trust again. We're choosing to trust better. We're choosing to love with our eyes open, to fight for what matters, and to never settle for less than we deserve." She looked down at Eleanor, who was staring up at her with the intense focus of someone just beginning to understand the world. "And this little girl is going to grow up knowing that love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you create, protect, and choose every single day." Outside, the spring rain began to fall gently on their garden, nourishing the seeds they'd planted and the new life they were building together. 6 months ago, Victoria Blackwood had walked into a courtroom expecting to lose everything. Instead, she discovered that sometimes the most devastating betrayals are just the universe's way of clearing space for something infinitely better. Eleanor gurgled softly, and Victoria realized her daughter was smiling, the first real smile of her young life. "See," Victoria whispered to her baby. "The world is full of beautiful surprises when you're brave enough to keep believing in them." As Richard's arms came around both of them, Victoria understood that she hadn't just survived the destruction of her old life. She'd used those broken pieces to build something stronger, more authentic, more joyful than anything she'd ever imagined possible. And in that moment, standing in the nursery of the home she'd chosen, holding the daughter she'd fought for, surrounded by the love she'd earned, Victoria Blackwood finally understood what victory actually looked like. It looked like peace. It looked like hope. It looked like the courage to start over and the wisdom to build something that would last. Epilogue 2 years later. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, addressed in handwriting Victoria recognized, but hadn't seen in over a year. Inside was a wedding invitation. Scarlett Morrison was marrying a software engineer in Portland, starting over with someone who knew her whole story and chose her anyway. The note attached was brief. Asterisk Victoria. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. I'm finally building a life that's mine. S asterisk. Victoria smiled, adding the invitation to the small collection of updates she'd received over the past 2 years. Daniel, now practicing pediatric surgery in Seattle and engaged to a fellow doctor who knew his history. David, who'd sold his company and moved to Costa Rica, where he was teaching English and apparently learning to be happy alone. Even Patricia Wells, who'd served 18 months in federal prison and was now working as a paralegal, rebuilding her life one small ethical choice at a time. Everyone had found their way to something better. Eleanor toddled into the kitchen, her dark hair curling around her face and her eyes bright with the mischief of a 2-year-old who'd inherited her mother's determination and her father's. Well, Daniel's stubborn streak. "Mama," she announced, holding up a crayon drawing that appeared to be either a horse or a rainbow. "Look." Victoria scooped up her daughter, marveling as she did every day at the miracle of this small person who'd emerged from so much pain and chaos to become pure joy. "It's beautiful, baby girl. Should we show Richard when he gets home?" Eleanor nodded enthusiastically. Richard had moved in 6 months ago, and Eleanor had taken to calling him Daddy Richard, with the casual acceptance of a child who'd never known life to be anything other than full of people who chose to love her. The front door opened and Richard's voice called out, "Where are my favorite ladies?" "Kitchen," Victoria called back, watching Eleanor wiggle with excitement. Richard appeared, still in his scrubs from the hospital, and Eleanor launched herself into his arms with the confidence of a child who'd never doubted she'd be caught. "How was your day?" Victoria asked, accepting the kiss he pressed to her forehead. "Good. Yours?" "Perfect." And Victoria meant it. Not because everything was easy, but because everything was real. Their love, their challenges, their hopes for the future. All of it built on the solid foundation of truth and choice rather than manipulation and need. "Victoria," Richard said, settling Eleanor on his hip, "I have something to ask you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, and Victoria felt her heart skip, not with fear, but with anticipation. "Eleanor and I have been talking," he said solemnly, "and we've decided we'd like to make this family official. What do you think, Mama? Want to marry your best friend?" Victoria looked at the man who'd waited for her, fought for her, and chosen to build a life that honored both her strength and her capacity for love. She looked at her daughter, who was clapping with delight as if she understood the magnitude of the moment. And she thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, broken, betrayed, convinced that love was something that happened to her rather than something she created. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, we do." As Richard slipped the ring onto her finger and Eleanor cheered with 2-year-old enthusiasm, Victoria realized that this moment of choosing love with wisdom, of building family with intention, of creating joy from the ashes of everything that had tried to destroy her. This was what happily ever after actually looked like. Not a fairy tale ending, but a beautiful beginning. And the best part? She'd earned every moment of it. What did this story teach you about the power of truth and the courage it takes to rebuild your life from the ground up? Victoria's journey shows us that sometimes our greatest betrayals become the catalysts for our most authentic victories. Drop your thoughts in the comments about how you found strength in your darkest moments, and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world. Because every ending is just another beginning waiting to be written.